Hello, and welcome to Buffy's World, where we explore the fascinating and controversial topics of American history. In today's video, we are going to talk about eugenics, a movement that aimed to improve the human race by selectively breeding people with desirable traits and eliminating those with undesirable ones. Sounds like a good idea, right? Well, not so fast. Eugenics has a dark and bloody history that involves racism, oppression, and genocide. How did eugenics start? What were its goals and methods? What were its consequences and impacts? And what are the ethical implications of eugenics for today and tomorrow? Stay tuned to find out. But before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of our new videos. And if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Now, let's dive into the world of eugenics. Eugenics is the practice or advocacy of improving the human species by selectively mating people with specific, desirable hereditary traits. It aims to reduce human suffering by, quote, breeding out, unquote, disease, disabilities, and so-called undesirable characteristics from the human population. Eugenics was coined by British scientist Francis Galton in 1883. And get this, Galton was influenced by his cousin, Charles Darwin, and Darwin's theory of natural selection and the discovery of Mendelian genetics. Eugenics was based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that certain traits and populations were genetically inferior and should be eliminated or prevented from reproducing. The supposed scientific goals of eugenics were to create a healthier, stronger, and more intelligent human race by applying the principles of genetics and heredity to social engineering. Some of the countries that adopted eugenics policies and practices in the early 20th century were the United States. The U.S. is one of the first and most influential countries to embrace eugenics. It enacted laws that authorized the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people in state institutions, prisons, and hospitals, as well as laws that restricted immigration, interracial marriage, and segregation. The U.S. also supported eugenics research and education through various organizations such as the American Breeders Association, the Race Betterment Foundation, and the Eugenics Record Office. Germany. Germany was heavily influenced by the U.S. eugenics movement and adopted many of its ideas and methods. Under the Nazi regime, Germany implemented a radical and violent form of eugenics known as racial hygiene that aimed to create a pure Aryan race and eliminate Jews, Roma, Slavs, homosexuals, disabled people, and other undesirables. Germany carried out mass sterilization, euthanasia, and genocide programs that killed millions of people in concentration camps and gas chambers. Germany also conducted unethical and horrific experiments on human subjects in the name of eugenics. Great Britain. British scientist Francis Galton advocated for positive eugenics, which encouraged people with high intelligence, health, and morality to reproduce more. He also proposed various methods to measure and classify human traits, such as biometrics, statistics, and surveys. Great Britain did not enact any compulsory sterilization or segregation laws, but it did support voluntary sterilization and family planning programs. It also had influential eugenics societies and journals that promoted eugenics education and research. Other countries. Many other countries around the world adopted or considered eugenics policies and practices in the early 20th century, such as Canada, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, France, Italy, Japan, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and South Africa. Some of these countries followed the example of the US or Germany in implementing coercive or discriminatory measures against certain groups of people. Others focused on positive or voluntary aspects of eugenics, such as improving public health, education, and welfare. Some countries also used eugenics to justify their colonial or imperial ambitions or to resist foreign domination. America's early fascination with improving human stock and genetics was part of the eugenics movement that emerged in the late 19th century and lasted until the mid-20th century. The U.S. eugenics movement was influenced by Galton, who believed that differences in human abilities were largely inherited and that eugenics could be used to direct human evolution and create a healthier, stronger, and more intelligent race. The U.S. eugenics movement was also motivated by social, economic, and political factors such as the rapid industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and population growth that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These changes created new challenges and anxieties for the U.S. society, such as poverty, crime, disease, unemployment, and social unrest. Many eugenicists blame these problems on the genetic inferiority of certain groups of people, such as the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, and people of color. They also feared that these groups would outbreed and outnumber the superior white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or WASP, population, which they considered to be the ideal American type. The U.S. eugenics movement gained popularity and support from many influential figures and institutions in the U.S., such as politicians, scientists, educators, philanthropists, religious leaders, and social reformers. They advocated for various eugenics policies and practices, such as forced sterilization. The U.S. enacted laws that authorized the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people who were deemed unfit to reproduce by the state authorities. These people were often institutionalized in state hospitals, prisons, or asylums where they were subjected to surgical procedures without their consent or knowledge. Restrictive immigration. The U.S. passed laws that restricted immigration from certain countries or regions that were considered to have inferior races or ethnicities. These laws were based on the pseudo-scientific concept of scientific racism, which classified human beings into different racial categories according to their physical characteristics and mental abilities. The most notorious example of these laws was the Immigration Act of 1924, which established a quota system that favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe over those from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Anti-miscegenation. The U.S. enacted laws that prohibited interracial marriage or sexual relations between people of different races or ethnicities. These laws were based on the belief that mixing different races would produce degenerate offspring that would weaken the purity and quality of the American gene pool. The most famous example of these laws was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 in Virginia, which defined a white person as someone who had no trace whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. Segregation. The U.S. enforced laws that segregated people of different races or ethnicities in various aspects of public and private life, such as education, housing, transportation, employment, healthcare, and recreation. These laws were based on the doctrine of separate but equal, which claimed that segregation did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as long as the facilities and services provided for each group were equivalent. However, in reality, segregation resulted in discrimination and inequality for people of color who received inferior treatment and opportunities compared to white people. The most prominent example of these laws was the Jim Crow system in the South that lasted from the late 19th century until the mid-20th century. Social Darwinism is a term that refers to the application of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection to human society and politics. Social Darwinists believe that human groups and races are subject to the same laws of natural selection as plants and animals, and that some are more fit to survive and reproduce than others. Social Darwinism has been used to justify various forms of inequality, oppression, and exploitation, such as imperialism, colonialism, racism, capitalism, and fascism. And one of the most controversial and harmful aspects of social Darwinism was its influence on eugenic thinking. Eugenics was seen as a scientific and progressive way to solve social problems such as poverty, crime, disease, and degeneration. Eugenicists advocated for various policies and practices such as positive eugenics. This involved encouraging people with high intelligence, health, and morality to reproduce more. This could be done through incentives, education, propaganda, or matchmaking. Positive eugenics aim to increase the proportion of superior individuals in the population. Negative eugenics. This involved preventing people with low intelligence, health, or morality from reproducing. This could be done through disincentives, restrictions, segregation, or sterilization. Negative eugenics aim to decrease the proportion of inferior individuals in the population. Racial eugenics. This involved promoting the purity and supremacy of certain races or ethnicities over others. This could be done through immigration control, anti-miscegenation laws, or genocide. Racial eugenics aim to create a homogeneous and dominant race. Eugenics was not only a scientific but also a political and ideological movement that was influenced by social Darwinism. Eugenicists often use social Darwinist arguments to justify their views and actions, such as survival of the fittest. This was the idea that only the strongest and most adaptable individuals or groups would survive and prosper in the struggle for existence. Eugenicists used this concept to rationalize why some people were more successful or powerful than others and why they deserved to be so. Natural selection. This was the idea that nature favored those individuals or groups that had advantageous traits or adaptations that enabled them to survive and reproduce better than others. Eugenicists used this concept to explain why some people had superior or inferior qualities or characteristics and why they should be selected for or against. Social progress. This was the idea that human society evolved from lower to higher stages of civilization through natural selection. Eugenicists used this concept to claim that eugenics was a necessary and beneficial way to accelerate social evolution and improve human welfare. To promote eugenics, many organizations, research institutions, and educational campaigns were established in various countries. Some of the examples are the American Breeders Association, or ABA. This was established in 1903 as an outgrowth of the American Agricultural Colleges and Experiment Stations. It was one of the first scientific organizations in the United States that recognized the importance of Mendel's laws, and its section on eugenics was the first scientific body to support eugenic research. The ABA published the Journal of Heredity, which disseminated eugenic ideas and data to the public. The ABA also organized conferences and committees to advise on eugenic policies and practices. The Eugenics Record Office, or ERO. This was established in 1910 by Charles Davenport, a prominent eugenicist and biologist with funding from the Carnegie Institution for Science. The ERO was located at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York and was the main center for eugenic research in the United States. The ERO collected a mass of family pedigrees and provided training for eugenics field workers who were sent to analyze individuals at various institutions, such as mental hospitals and orphanages across the United States. The ERO also produced publications such as Eugenical News and Eugenics that advocated for eugenic policies and practices. The American Eugenics Society, or AES. This was established in 1921 by Harry Lawlin, a close associate of Davenport and the director of the ERO. The AES was a social organization that aimed to popularize eugenics among the general public and influence public opinion towards responsible eugenic values in parenthood. The AES organized exhibitions, lectures, films, contests, and fairs that showcase eugenic ideals and achievements. The AES also lobbied for eugenic legislation such as sterilization laws and immigration restrictions. The British Eugenics Education Society, or BEES. This was established in 1907 by Francis Galton. The BEES was a scientific society that aimed to educate people about eugenics and encourage them to practice positive eugenics by choosing suitable mates and having healthy children. The BEES published a eugenics review, which promoted eugenic research and education. The BEES also supported voluntary sterilization and family planning programs. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, or KWI-A. This was established in 1927 in Berlin, Germany, with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. The KWI-A was a research institute that conducted studies on human genetics, anthropology, racial hygiene, and eugenics. The KWI-A was led by Eugene Fischer, a prominent German eugenicist and racial scientist who had conducted unethical experiments on African people in German colonies. The KWI-A collaborated with Nazi authorities to provide scientific justification for their racial policies and programs such as sterilization, euthanasia, and genocide. These are some of the examples of how eugenics was institutionalized and propagated in different countries. However, eugenics was not only a scientific but also a political and ideological movement that was influenced not only by social Darwinism but also by scientific racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, colonialism, and imperialism. Eugenics had devastating ethical and moral consequences for millions of people who were discriminated against, oppressed, exploited, or killed because of their perceived genetic inferiority or undesirability. Eugenics also had tragic scientific consequences for undermining the validity and credibility of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology by using flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions. Some of the key eugenic policies that were implemented in the U.S. and other countries in the early 20th century were marriage restrictions. Many states enacted laws that prohibited people who were deemed unfit to reproduce from marrying. These laws often targeted people with mental or physical disabilities, low intelligence, criminal records, or certain racial or ethnic backgrounds. The laws were based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that these traits were inherited and would contaminate the gene pool of the population. The laws also aimed to prevent interracial marriage or miscegenation, which was seen as a threat to racial purity and superiority. Segregation. Many states enforced laws that segregated people who were considered unfit from the rest of society. These laws often confined people with mental or physical disabilities, mental illness, or criminal records to state institutions, prisons, or asylums where they were subjected to poor living conditions, abuse, neglect, and sterilization. The laws also segregated people of different races or ethnicities in various aspects of public and private life, such as education, housing, transportation, employment, healthcare, and recreation. The laws were based on the doctrine of separate but equal, which claimed that segregation did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Forced sterilization. This is the practice of permanently preventing a person from reproducing without their consent or knowledge. It is a violation of human rights and dignity and has been used as a tool of oppression and discrimination against various groups of people, such as people with disabilities, people of color, poor people, and women. forced sterilization has a long and dark history in the United States and other countries, where it has often been justified by the pseudo-scientific and racist ideology of eugenics. In the early 20th century, many states in the United States enacted laws that allowed for forced sterilizations of people who were deemed unfit to reproduce by the state authorities. These people were often institutionalized in state hospitals, prisons, or asylums where they were subjected to surgical procedures without their consent or knowledge. The laws were based on the belief that forced sterilization would reduce social problems such as poverty, crime, disease, and degeneration. The laws also aimed to prevent interracial marriage or miscegenation, which was seen as a threat to racial purity and superiority. According to a new report from the National Women's Law Center, 31 states, plus Washington, D.C., still have laws explicitly allowing forced sterilization. Some of these laws are quite recent. The two most recent state laws regarding forced sterilization were passed in 2019 in Iowa and Nevada. The report also reveals that 17 states allow the permanent surgical sterilization of children with disabilities. The U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, from 1927, upheld the constitutionality of these laws, stating that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. The case involved Carrie Buck, a young woman who was committed to a state institution for epileptics and feeble-minded after she gave birth to an illegitimate child. She was selected as the first person to be sterilized under the Virginia law, which was part of the eugenics movement that sought to improve the human race by eliminating undesirable traits and populations. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the majority opinion that affirmed the state's power to sterilize Ms. Buck. The decision was widely criticized by civil rights activists, legal scholars, and medical experts who argued that it violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, as well as the basic human rights and dignity of the individuals subjected to sterilization. The decision also had a lasting impact on the eugenics movement in the U.S. and abroad, as it inspired and influenced similar laws and policies in other states and countries, such as Nazi Germany. The decision has never been formally overturned by the Supreme Court, but it has been effectively nullified by subsequent cases and legislation that protect the rights of people with disabilities and prohibit involuntary sterilization. However, some forms of forced sterilization still persist today in various contexts, such as prenatal screening, genetic engineering, reproductive technologies, immigration policies, and racial discrimination. Forced sterilization has affected thousands of people in the United States and other countries. Here are some case studies or personal stories of individuals who were sterilized without their knowledge or against their will. Kelly Dillon. Kelly Dillon was a 24-year-old inmate in the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla when she underwent a surgery to remove a cyst and take a biopsy in 2001. She later discovered that the surgeons had also removed her ovaries without her consent or knowledge, effectively rendering her infertile. She sued the prison and the doctors for medical malpractice, but the case was dismissed due to the statute of limitations. She became an advocate for other women who were coerced or deceived into sterilization while incarcerated, and her story was featured in the documentary Belly of the Beast. Elaine Riddick. Elaine Riddick was a 14-year-old girl who was raped by a neighbor and became pregnant in 1967. She gave birth to a son at a hospital in North Carolina, where she was also sterilized without her consent or knowledge under the state's eugenics program. The program targeted people who were deemed feeble-minded or socially inadequate by the state authorities and authorized the sterilization of more than 7,600 people between 1929 and 1974. Riddick later learned that she had been sterilized when she tried to have another child with her husband. She sued the state for violating her human rights, but lost the case. She became an activist for the rights of sterilization victims and testified before a state panel that recommended compensation for survivors in 2012. Andrea Garcia. Andrea Garcia was a 19-year-old woman who was born in Mexico and immigrated to the United States with her family in 1939. She suffered from epilepsy and was admitted to a state asylum near Los Angeles for those afflicted with feeble-mindedness in 1941. She was diagnosed as a typical low-grade moron and sterilized without her consent or knowledge under the California law that allowed the sterilization of people with mental disabilities or illnesses. The law was part of the eugenics movement that sought to improve the human race by eliminating undesirable traits in populations, and resulted in the sterilization of more than 20,000 people in California between 1909 and 1979. Garcia later escaped from the asylum and lived with her sister until she died in 1998. The primary targets of eugenics were those who were seen as unfit for society or a threat to the genetic quality of the human population. These included people who were living in institutions, people of color, the poor, and those deemed mentally unfit. Some of the examples of how these groups were targeted by eugenics are people living in institutions. Many people who had mental or physical disabilities, mental illnesses, or criminal records were confined to state institutions, such as hospitals, prisons, or asylums, where they were subjected to poor living conditions, abuse, neglect, and sterilization. Many states enacted laws that authorized the forced sterilization of people who were deemed unfit to reproduce by the state authorities. Remember the U.S. Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell? People of color. Many people who belong to ethnic or racial minorities, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, or Latinos, were discriminated against and oppressed by eugenics policies and practices. They were often stereotyped as inferior, savage, lazy, or immoral by eugenicists who used scientific racism to justify their views. They were also subjected to immigration control, anti-miscegenation laws, segregation laws, or genocide programs that aimed to prevent them from mixing with or outnumbering the dominant white population. For example, remember in Nazi Germany, Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other undesirables were exterminated in concentration camps and gas chambers as part of the racial hygiene and genocide programs there. The poor. Many people who lived in poverty or low socioeconomic status were also targeted by eugenics, as they were seen as a burden or a menace to society. They were often blamed for social problems such as crime, disease, unemployment, and social unrest by eugenicists who ignored the structural and environmental factors that contributed to their situation. They were also discouraged or prevented from reproducing through incentives, disincentives, restrictions, or sterilization. For example, in some states, the U.S. welfare recipients were required to undergo sterilization or contraception as a condition for receiving aid. Those deemed mentally unfit. Many people who had low intelligence or mental abilities were also considered unfit for society or reproduction by geneticists who believed that intelligence was largely inherited and could be measured by standardized tests. They were often labeled as feeble-minded, morons, imbeciles, or idiots by eugenicists who used flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions to support their claims. They were also subjected to segregation, sterilization, or euthanasia programs that aimed to eliminate them from the gene pool. For example, in California, remember that more than 20,000 people were sterilized between 1909 and 1979 under the state law that allowed the sterilization of people with mental disabilities or illnesses. These are some of the examples of how eugenics targeted those who were living in institutions, people of color, the poor, and those deemed mentally unfit. The eugenics policies that allowed for forced sterilizations, marriage restrictions, and segregation of those considered unfit had significant racial, class, and gendered implications for the people who were targeted by them. Some of the implications were racial implications. The eugenics policies were based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that certain races or ethnicities were genetically inferior and should be prevented from reproducing or mixing with the dominant white population. These policies discriminated against and oppressed people of color, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos who were stereotyped as inferior, savage, lazy, or immoral by a eugenicist. These policies also influenced other discriminatory policies, such as restrictive immigration laws, anti-miscegenation laws, and segregation laws that aim to maintain the racial purity and supremacy of the white population. These policies resulted in the violation of human rights and dignity, the denial of social and economic opportunities, and the exposure to violence and abuse for people of color. Class implications. The eugenics policies were also based on the assumption that poverty or low socioeconomic status was a sign of genetic inferiority and a source of social problems. These policies discriminated against and oppressed the poor, who were blamed for crime, disease, unemployment, and social unrest by eugenicists. These policies also influenced other policies that aimed to reduce the welfare or aid for the poor, such as sterilization or contraception requirements for welfare recipients. These policies resulted in the deprivation of basic needs and rights, the lack of access to education and health care, and the marginalization and stigmatization of the poor. Gender implications. The eugenics policies were also based on the assumption that women's primary role was to reproduce and that their reproductive choices should be controlled by the state or society. Bullshit. These policies discriminated against and oppressed women, especially women of color or poor women, who were seen as unfit mothers or breeders by eugenicists. These policies also influenced other policies that aimed to restrict women's reproductive rights and autonomy, such as abortion bans or family planning programs. These policies resulted in the violation of bodily integrity and privacy, the loss of fertility and parenthood, and the exposure to medical malpractice and coercion for women. The Buck versus Bell ruling had a wide-reaching impact on the eugenics movement and the sterilization policies in the United States and other countries. Some of the effects were: it legitimized eugenic sterilization. The ruling affirmed the constitutionality of the Virginia law that authorized the forced sterilization of people who were deemed feeble-minded or socially inadequate by the state authorities. The ruling also provided a legal precedent and a moral justification for other states to enact or enforce similar laws. The ruling was based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that certain traits and populations were genetically inferior and should be prevented from reproducing. The ruling also expressed a utilitarian and paternalistic view that sterilization was a lesser sacrifice for the public welfare and the individual's own good. It sparked many states to adopt similar policies. After the ruling, more than 30 states adopted or revised their sterilization laws to conform to the Virginia model. As a result, more than 60,000 people, mostly women of color, poor people, and people with disabilities, were forcibly sterilized in the United States between 1927 and 1979. Some states also expanded their criteria for sterilization to include people with alcoholism, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, or homosexuality. Some states also performed sterilizations without proper hearings, consent, or notification. Some states also coerced or deceived people into sterilization by threatening to withhold welfare benefits or medical care. It influenced other countries to follow suit. The ruling also had an international impact as it inspired and influenced other countries to adopt or implement eugenic sterilization laws or policies. For example, Nazi Germany cited Buck versus Bell as the model for its law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, which authorized the sterilization of more than 400,000 people who were considered unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. The Nazi law also paved the way for more extreme measures, such as euthanasia and genocide, that killed millions of Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other undesirables in concentration camps and gas chambers. Other countries that adopted or considered eugenic sterilization laws or policies included Canada, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Japan, China, Brazil, Peru, and Mexico. According to one source, The 30 states that adopted or revised their sterilization law to conform to the Virginia model from the Buck versus Bell case were Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, North Carolina, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Carolina, South Dakota, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, and West Virginia. The eugenics movement gained popularity and support in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in Europe and North America, where it was seen as a scientific and progressive way to solve social problems such as poverty, crime, disease, and degeneration. However, the eugenics movement declined after World War II when its atrocities were exposed and condemned by the international community. The most notorious example of eugenics in action was Nazi Germany. The association of eugenics with Nazi atrocities had a profound impact on the public perception and acceptance of eugenics. Many people were shocked and disgusted by the extent and brutality of Nazi eugenics and realized that eugenics was not a benign or beneficial science, but a dangerous and immoral ideology that violated human rights and dignity. Many people also recognized that eugenics was based on flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions that ignored the complexity and diversity of human nature. Many people also questioned the authority and credibility of eugenicists who had supported or collaborated with Nazi eugenics. As a result of the association of eugenics with Nazi atrocities, many countries began to abandon or revise their eugenics policies and practices after World War II. For example, in the United States, many states repealed or stopped enforcing their sterilization laws that had authorized the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people who were deemed unfit to reproduce by the state authorities. The U.S. also stopped supporting eugenics research and education through various organizations such as the American Breeders Association, the Race Betterment Foundation, and the Eugenics Record Office. The U.S. also faced legal challenges from civil rights activists who argued that sterilization laws violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. However, some states continued to carry out forced sterilizations until the 1970s, especially on women of color or poor women who were coerced or deceived into sterilization by medical professionals or welfare officials. In Germany, the Allied forces abolished the Nazi laws that had authorized the sterilization, euthanasia, and genocide of millions of people who were considered unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. The Allied forces also prosecuted many Nazi officials and doctors who were involved in eugenics crimes in the Nuremberg trials, where they were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The Allied forces also dismantled the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, or KWI-A, which was a research institute that had conducted studies on human genetics, anthropology, racial hygiene, and eugenics. The Allied forces also confiscated or destroyed many eugenic records and documents that had been collected by the Nazis. In Britain, the British Eugenics Education Society, or BEES, which was a scientific society that had advocated for positive eugenics by encouraging people with high intelligence, health, and morality to reproduce more, changed its name to the Galton Institute in 1989 and shifted its focus from eugenics to genetics, demography, and reproductive health. The Galton Institute also acknowledged its past involvement in eugenics, apologized for its support of coercive or discriminatory measures against certain groups of people, and denounced any form of eugenics that violated human rights or dignity. These are some examples of how the association of eugenics with Nazi atrocities led to the decline of the movement after World War II. But even after the fall of the eugenics movement's popularity, some states in the United States continued to perform sterilizations on people who were considered unfit to reproduce by the state authorities. These people were often women of color, poor women, or people with disabilities who were coerced or deceived into sterilization by medical professionals or welfare officials. Some of the reasons why these states continued sterilization practices were lack of legal oversight. Some states did not repeal or stop enforcing their sterilization laws that had authorized the forced sterilization of tens of thousands of people who were deemed feeble-minded or socially inadequate by the state authorities. Racial and class bias. Some states continued to target people who belonged to ethnic or racial minorities, such as African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, or Latinos, who were discriminated against and oppressed by eugenics policies and practices. They were often stereotyped as inferior, savage, lazy, or immoral by eugenicists who used scientific racism to justify their views. They were also subjected to immigration control, anti-miscegenation laws, segregation laws, or genocide programs that aimed to prevent them from mixing with or outnumbering the dominant white population. Some states also continued to target people who lived in poverty or low socioeconomic status, who were seen as a burden or a menace to society. They were often blamed for social problems such as crime, disease, unemployment, and social unrest by eugenicists who ignored the structural and environmental factors that contributed to their situation. They were also discouraged or prevented from reproducing through incentives, disincentives, restrictions, or sterilization. Medical and social control. Some states continue to use sterilization as a means of medical and social control over people who had low intelligence or mental abilities, mental illnesses, criminal records, or sexual deviance. They were often labeled as feeble-minded, morons, imbeciles, or idiots by eugenicists who use flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions to support their claims. They were also subjected to segregation, sterilization, or euthanasia programs that aimed to eliminate them from the gene pool. Some states also use sterilization as a way of regulating women's reproductive rights and autonomy, such as abortion bans or family planning programs. They often viewed women's primary role as reproduction and their reproductive choices as subject to state or society's control. These are some of the examples of how some states continued sterilization practices even after the fall of the eugenics movement's popularity. These practices had devastating ethical and moral consequences for thousands of people who were violated, deprived of their human rights, dignity, fertility, and parenthood, and exposed to medical malpractice and coercion. These practices also had tragic scientific consequences for undermining the validity and credibility of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology by using those flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions. These practices also had social consequences for perpetuating inequality, oppression, and discrimination against various groups of people. The eugenics movement was a global phenomenon that aimed to improve the human race by selectively breeding people with desirable traits and eliminating those with undesirable ones. The movement was based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that certain traits and populations were genetically inferior and should be prevented from reproducing. The movement gained popularity and support in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in Europe and North America, where it was seen as a scientific and progressive way to solve social problems such as poverty, crime, disease, and degeneration. However, the eugenics movement declined after World War II when its atrocities were exposed and condemned by the international community. The most notorious example of eugenics in action was Nazi Germany, which implemented a radical and violent form of eugenics known as racial hygiene that aimed to create a pure Aryan nation. However, some forms of eugenics still persist today in various contexts, such as prenatal screening, genetic engineering, reproductive technologies, immigration policies, and racial discrimination. And many of the modern implications of the eugenics movement include ethical debates around genetics and reproductive rights. For example, prenatal screening. This involves testing fetuses for genetic diseases or disorders before birth. Prenatal screening can help parents prepare for or prevent certain conditions in their children. However, prenatal screening can also raise ethical issues such as who should have access to prenatal screening? What kind of information should be provided or withheld from parents? What are the possible psychological or social effects of prenatal screening on parents and children? How should parents decide whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy based on prenatal screening results? And how should society support or respect the choices of parents and the rights of children with genetic conditions? Genetic engineering. This involves modifying the genes of living organisms to alter their traits or functions. Genetic engineering can have various applications in medicine, agriculture, industry, and research. However, genetic engineering can also raise ethical issues such as what are the potential benefits and risks of genetic engineering for human health and the environment? Who should have the authority and responsibility to regulate or monitor genetic engineering? What are the possible social or economic impacts of genetic engineering on different groups of people or countries? And how should society balance the interests of individuals, communities, and future generations in relation to genetic engineering? Reproductive technologies. These involve using artificial or assisted methods to conceive, carry, or deliver a child. Reproductive technologies can help people overcome infertility or other reproductive challenges. However, reproductive technologies can also raise ethical issues such as who should have access to reproductive technologies? What are the legal and moral implications of using donor gametes, embryos, or surrogates? What are the possible physical or emotional effects of reproductive technologies on parents, children, and donors or surrogates? And how should society address the issues of identity, kinship, and inheritance that arise from reproductive technologies? These are some examples of how genetics and reproductive rights are related to the modern implications of the eugenics movement. These topics are complex and controversial and require careful consideration of scientific facts, ethical principles, and social values. Some states have made public apologies or offered reparations to victims of forced sterilizations. Some of these states are Virginia. Virginia was the first state to formally apologize for its forced sterilizations in 2002. Virginia also agreed to give surviving victims $25,000 each in 2015. North Carolina. North Carolina was the first state to pass a law to compensate the surviving victims of its eugenics program in 2013. North Carolina paid $35,000 to 220 surviving victims in 2014. North Carolina's eugenics program targeted mostly black women who were sterilized without their consent or knowledge between 1933 and 1974. California. California has not passed a law to compensate the surviving victims of its eugenics program, which resulted in the sterilization of more than 20,000 people between 1909 and 1979. However, California has recognized and attempted to atone for more recent cases of forced sterilizations in its prisons, where more than 1,400 women were sterilized without proper consent between 1997 and 2013. California passed a law in 2014 to ban sterilizations for birth control purposes in its prisons, and another law in 2021 to provide $25,000 to each survivor of prison sterilizations. Pseudoscience is a system of beliefs or claims that are presented as scientific, but lack the evidence, methods, or rigor of real science. Pseudoscience can be harmful for several reasons, such as it can spread misinformation and confusion about important topics, such as health, environment, history, or society. It can undermine the credibility and authority of science and scientific experts who rely on facts, logic, and peer review to draw valid and reliable conclusions. It can exploit people's ignorance, fear, or bias and persuade them to accept false or unsupported claims that serve the interest of certain groups or agendas. It can lead to poor or dangerous decisions and actions that can harm individuals, communities, or the world. One example of pseudoscience that has had serious consequences is eugenics. Eugenics was the study or practice of improving the genetic quality of the human population by selectively breeding people with desirable traits and eliminating those with undesirable ones. Eugenics was based on the pseudoscientific and racist assumption that certain traits and populations were genetically inferior and should be prevented from reproducing. Eugenics was influenced by social Darwinism, which applied Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection to human society and politics. Eugenics had devastating ethical and moral consequences for millions of people who were discriminated against, oppressed, exploited, or killed because of their perceived genetic inferiority or undesirability. Eugenics also had tragic scientific consequences for undermining the validity and credibility of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology by using flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions. Eugenics also had social consequences for perpetuating inequality, oppression, and discrimination against various groups of people. Eugenics was not only a scientific, but also a political and ideological movement that was influenced by prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion or judgment that is not based on reason or experience. Prejudice can be harmful for several reasons, such as it can distort reality and prevent people from seeing things as they are, rather than as they want them to be. It can create stereotypes and biases that simplify and generalize people's characteristics and behaviors without considering their individuality and diversity. It can foster negative emotions and attitudes such as hatred, fear, anger, or resentment towards people who are different or disagree with one's views. It can justify discrimination and oppression such as exclusion, segregation, violence, or persecution against people who are perceived as inferior or threatening. One example of prejudice that has influenced policy is racism. Racism is the belief that one's race or ethnicity is superior or inferior to another's, and that one's race or ethnicity determines one's abilities, worth, or rights. Racism has been used to justify various policies and practices that have discriminated against and oppressed people of color, such as restrictive immigration laws that limited or banned the entry of certain races or ethnicities into a country, anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited interracial marriage or sexual relations between people of different races or ethnicities, segregation laws that separated people of different races or ethnicities in various aspects of public and private life, such as education, housing, transportation, employment, healthcare, and recreation. Genocide programs that exterminated people of a certain race or ethnicity in an attempt to eliminate them from the world. These policies and practices had devastating ethical and moral consequences for millions of people. These policies and practices also had tragic scientific consequences for undermining the validity and credibility of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology by using pseudoscientific concepts such as scientific racism, which classify human beings into different racial categories according to their physical characteristics and mental abilities. These policies and practices also had social consequences for creating conflict, division, and hatred among different groups of people. Therefore, it is important to remember this chapter of history to avoid repeating such violations of human rights. It is also important to be aware of the dangers of pseudoscience and the consequences of allowing prejudice to influence policy. We should strive to promote and protect human rights and dignity for all people, regardless of their genetic traits or backgrounds. We should also foster a culture of scientific integrity, responsibility, and ethics that respects the limits and implications of scientific knowledge and practice. We should also cultivate a culture of critical thinking, curiosity, and openness that values evidence, logic, and diversity over ignorance, fear, or bias. The eugenics movement was a tragic example of how pseudoscience, racism, and ideology can lead to the oppression, exploitation, and extermination of millions of people who were considered unfit or undesirable by the state or by society. The eugenics movement also showed how science can be misused or abused to justify or rationalize immoral and inhumane actions. The eugenics movement also had lasting consequences for the fields of biology, psychology, sociology, and anthropology, as it undermined their validity and credibility by using flawed methods, biased data, and false assumptions. By remembering this chapter of history, we can learn from the mistakes and failures of the past and prevent them from happening again in the future. We can also honor and respect the victims and survivors of eugenics and acknowledge their suffering and resilience. We can also raise awareness and educate ourselves and others about the dangers and harms of eugenics and the value and diversity of human life. We can also promote and protect human rights and dignity for all people, regardless of their genetic traits or backgrounds. We can also foster a culture of scientific integrity, responsibility, and ethics that respects the limits and implications of scientific knowledge and practice. Thank you for watching this video where we discuss the history and implications of the eugenics movement and how it relates to the current and future challenges of genetics and reproductive rights. We hope you learned something new and interesting, and that you are inspired to think critically and ethically about the scientific developments that affect our lives and society. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Buffy's World channel for more content like this. We also invite you to join the conversation in the comments section below, where you can share your thoughts, opinions, and questions on this topic. We would love to hear from you and learn from your perspectives. As always, we encourage you to stay informed and vigilant about the ethics of emerging scientific fields and to support the promotion and protection of human rights and dignity for all people, regardless of their genetic traits or backgrounds. Remember that science is a powerful tool that can be used for good or evil, depending on how we use it and who we use it for. Let us use science wisely and responsibly, and let us use it for the benefit of humanity and the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.